Thanks very much. Yeah, good morning, everyone. It's great to be here. I'm sorry to not be at the Cybersecurity Forum in person, but hopefully can still provide a good overview of the main threats that we're seeing at Mandiant. For context, Mandiant is a incident response and threat intelligence firm. So what we do is try and make all of that data that we're seeing through those frontline engagements available to organizations. But with only 15 minutes available, I want to make sure that we get into this as quickly as possible. So if we could go to the first slide, please. So when it comes to the CEE region, really starting to see a variety of different threats play out across the different countries. I think for the most part, and perhaps no surprise, Russia is the main and most active threat within the region, but also seeing other states come to the fore. Belarus and China are some of the main actors that we're seeing there, the main hacker groups that we're seeing, but we are also seeing some other espionage activity there as well. And ultimately that is because cyber operations signal states' broader interests. And that is they're increasingly being used to achieve those strategic objectives. And we're seeing that play out in CEE as a whole. I'll talk a little bit as well at the end of the presentation about ransomware. It's probably no surprise that this is starting to also have an impact in CEE, given the huge profile and the growing cyber criminal ecosystem that we're observing at the moment. If I could go to the next slide, please. I think when it comes to state operations, and actually really seeing this when it comes to Russia and Ukraine, and particularly what's going on within Ukraine, but I think there are also clear implications there for the CEE region as a whole. We're really seeing the likes of Russia, among other states, conduct cyber operations or turning to cyber capabilities to carry out at least 3 types of operations. I think we've seeing some reporting recently around more disruptive or even destructive cyber attacks. These are those that are maybe interacting with, at times, physical processes around energy infrastructure, those sorts of things, but might also include the deployment of, say, wiper malware that is rendering systems unusable. Clearly can have some very significant impacts when that is targeting critical systems. Also seeing cyber espionage as kind of traditional information gathering, the sort of thing that we've seen take place now for decades, and cyber increasingly a way for governments to obtain geopolitical and strategic information. And something that we've seen play out, particularly within CE, is the use of cyber to conduct information operations. This is not just on social media, on websites more broadly, distributing narratives via compromised accounts, compromised government websites. Also, it goes back to that point around cyber espionage, because it is often information that is first being stolen through network intrusions and then it's leaked online. So really we're seeing all of these 3 areas play out, particularly within Ukraine, but there are broader implications, as I mentioned, and we've certainly seen all 3 of these across CEE region. If I go to next slide, please. When it comes to the main threat, as I mentioned, it is Russia, which is probably no surprise. I think Russia, we've seen over the coming years, has developed very impressive cyber capabilities. I'll talk about some of those specific groups in a minute, but I think the broad takeaway here is actually really all of the main Russian military and intelligence agencies are now turning to cyber operations. That means a few things. I think, first of all, it means that Russian cyber operations can look very different. I think Russia is often unfairly or unreasonably kind of framed in terms of cyber operations as being very retaliatory. It's being very reactive in this almost emotional state. We certainly see that with the likes of the GRU, these very destructive, these very loud and brazen type of operations. But we also see cyber operations that are incredibly stealthy, that are incredibly long-term and strategically focused. If we look at the likes of APT29, a group that's linked to the SVR, they've been very patient in their approach. So really the point here, number one, is that we're seeing a variety of different Russian cyber groups that reflect the different types of mandates, incentives, and cultures of those different military intelligence agencies. And that leads to different types of operations, whether that's stealthy information theft or whether that is more destructive type of operations. The second point here is that because of all of those different agencies turning to cyber, it now means that the overall capacity of Russian cyber capability very high. That allows them to conduct multiple operations simultaneously across different time zones. Go for the next slide, please. I think the main Russian group that we've seen specifically active within the CEE region is APT29. This is a group, as I mentioned, linked to the SVR, and probably most well known in recent times for being linked to the 2020 SolarWinds supply chain compromise. So that really just highlighted their long-term focus, their real impressive capability. This is a group that stands out for so many different reasons, whether that is the agility of their operations, their ability to spend time getting to know internal operating environments. I think what was interesting about SolarWinds is it showed that this group really understood how cyber incident response engagements work, and they did everything they could to make those incident response engagements as difficult as possible for future network defenders. So it's a really kind of impressive capability, not just on the technical side, but also, for example, to conduct different compromises across different time zones and at that real high operational tempo. So you can see on the right-hand side, this is a group that is very active within CEE. This isn't just an area around, say, Ukraine or the West. CEE is absolutely a prime target for this group. And for the most part, they've targeted Western and European governments more broadly. So government is absolutely their main kind of area of focus, but also gone after the likes of education, telecommunication, medical research entities in the past, organizations that provide that third-party access, whether that's technology companies, IT, or business service providers as well. And then I think the final thing to say is that they have an interest in those government-adjacent organizations, so the likes of contractors or service providers to government entities. Go to the next slide, because while within the cybersecurity industry, we talk a lot about the likes of Russia or China, I think what's interesting is we're starting to see a number of different states now invest in cyber capabilities. So one thing that we're seeing more and more now over the last few months and years is UNC 1151. This is a group that we track, that we assess with high confidence to be linked to the Belarusian government. And these operations have focused on obtaining confidential information from targets, but there's also got some good evidence that this is a group that is supporting information operations within the kind of surrounding region and within the likes of Ukraine, Lithuania, Latvia, Poland, as well as places like Germany. So when we talk about that support of those broader information operation campaigns, these have primarily promoted anti-NATO narratives. So they've really been focused on trying to undercut regional security within CEE and putting out disinformation, trying to really destabilize things. There's some discussion of if those ghostwriter information operation campaigns are conducted by Russia. We're not taking a view of how much this could be a combined between Belarus and Russia. All we're saying at this point is that when it comes to 51, we've got that high confidence that Belarus is involved, but we're not necessarily making a judgment on the level of collaboration there that's been discussed by others. I want to move to the next slide because been some really interesting developments with China over the last few years. China has conducted over the last few years some very extensive and intensive restructuring within its military and intelligence apparatus, and that's led to quite a lot of operational bundling. So cyber threat groups that previously appeared to be distinct or there didn't seem to be too much overlap, We're starting to see some consolidation there in more recent years. But what's interesting is after all of this restructuring, we're starting to see far more decisive and ultimately aggressive cyber operations coming out of China. Chinese groups appear to be less sensitive to public attribution or public indictments, name and shame strategies, for instance. So they're resuming activity much more quickly after these government statements are put out. We're seeing Chinese information operations now growing in scope, something that was previously only focused on its domestic and near abroad. On issues like Hong Kong, Taiwan, Xinjiang, we're now seeing Chinese information operations spill out into other social media and other kind of websites being conducted in a variety of different languages. So we're starting to see that global expansion in information operations. And I think also seeing some of the groups that previously looked to be dormant or had disappeared, now starting to see them re-emerge. When it comes to Chinese groups, we've seen a variety of them target CEE in the past few years. If we could go to the next slide, I think one thing that comes up a lot is that connection to the Belt and Road Initiative being a core driver of Chinese-linked cyber threat activity. Now, I'll be completely honest, when we look at the sectors that would be relevant to Belt and Road, the likes of government, telecommunications, mining, energy, perhaps transport as well, when we look at a lot of that Belt and Road connected cyber operations, a lot of that has been focused on the Asia Pacific region. So that's important to know. However, we have detected a smaller subset of those operations that appear to be connected to these broader geopolitical Belt and Road initiatives that have also targeted Europe and the likes of CEE as well. So it does highlight that there is a variety of different threats. As I mentioned, talked about Russia, Belarus, China. Those aren't the only threat groups that we see target the CEE. We've also seen the likes of North Korea, Iran, potentially APT-36, a Pakistani associated threat group. These groups aren't necessarily directly targeting CEE. They might be conducting global operations that conduct CEE countries, probably more as kind of secondary or tertiary targets. But I think it highlights, nevertheless, that we see a variety of different threats there, and that's really important to understand that there is that increasing variety in the threat landscape. If we go to the next slide, we are also seeing a growing cybercrime wave really across Europe. I think a lot of these ransomware groups traditionally have focused very much on North America, but we're starting to see a lot of law enforcement and government pressure within the Americas. And I think that is perhaps part of the reason that we are seeing some of these cyber criminal groups increasingly focus on Europe. I think the other thing to say about Europe is that there is probably more mixed cybersecurity maturity within the region. So I think Europe is more likely to have high revenue but low cybersecurity maturity organizations than perhaps North America at this current moment in time. So we are starting to see ransomware groups become increasingly interested in this and start to have a very critical impact there. So that's my final. If we go to the last slide, see him running low on time. I think the last thing to say is that there are going to be some distinct threats to each country in CEE, right? If we look at Poland, there might be specific interest right now from Russia around supply routes in relation to Ukraine. We might look at a country like Estonia that might be targeted specifically around something like e-government. So there are some unique threats, but I think there are also some common threats, as I've discussed today. So that really does highlight the benefit of talking about threats to the region and building some really robust regional cooperation around cybersecurity. Thanks very much, everybody, and I'll defer back to the organisers.